Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're going over the last two evocations of the Lore of the Forge, along with the Apocalyptic Form. In the previous episode, we've seen that the Malefactor can enhance, activate, and shape an object into any desired form, so in this one we're going to see how they create Enchanted and Demonic Relics. Without further ado, Enchant Object. This powerful evocation is the one most often associated with the Angels of the Earth, the ability to infuse objects with supernatural qualities that make ordinary mortals into heroes or monsters. Many such objects are created for that purpose, but malefactors are also adept at taking pre-existing items and infusing them with frightening new capabilities. System. Creating an enchanted object is a laborious and expensive process requiring substantial investments of time and energy. If the malefactor creates the object intended for enchantment, the difficulty for performing the evocation is 6. If she works with an existing object, the difficulty is 8. To enchant an item, the demon must first possess a lore path that evokes the investiture in question. For example, if the demon wants to create a magic mirror that shows an illusion of perfect beauty to whoever looks into its depths, she needs to possess at least one dot in the lore of light, the path governing illusions. More complex effects could conceivably require a combination of pertinent lore. If the demon wanted the mirror to sense a mortal's deepest desire and present an illusion depicting it, he would need some measure of the lore of light and the lore of humanity. The storyteller is the final arbiter on what lore is needed, and to what level, to create a particular object. Enchanted items draw upon the wielder's inherent belief to perform their supernatural functions. Mortals, including thralls, require a successful willpower roll difficulty 8 to access an object's abilities, while demons require a successful faith roll difficulty 6. This roll must be made each time the item is used. If either roll botches, the character loses 1 point of the relevant trait. Alternatively, characters can attune an object to them and create a permanent link that keeps the item energized at all times. Attuning an item thus costs 1 point of permanent willpower in the case of mortals and thralls, or 1 point of permanent faith in the case of demons. Once attuned, the character can use the device at will without requiring a dice roll to activate it. If the demon possesses the required knowledge, make an extended Dexterity plus Crafts roll and expend a faith point. The number of successes required depends on the power and scope of the enchantment. A simple creation such as a knife that never loses its edge requires 1 success. A key that opens any lock requires 5. A magic mirror that shows a mortal attaining her deepest desire requires 10. If a creation roll botches, the item is destroyed. This evocation cannot be used on high-tech items such as computers or other electronic hardware. Torment. Monstrous demons create cursed objects that consume the souls of their owners and wreak misery on those close to them. Cursed objects botch on a roll of 1 or 2, and the consequences of such a mishap are always directed at either the wielder or any friends or loved ones who happen to be nearby. Further, instead of making a dice roll to activate the object, mortals, including thralls, lose 1 point of willpower with each use, while demons gain 1 point of temporary torment. Okay, as mentioned in the previous episode, there are corrected and expanded rules for crafting an enchanted relic, but before pointing out the differences, it's good to point out the similarities. The rules that always stand from both the core book and the player's guide are the difficulties, the attunement rules, and the craft roll, which is always Dexterity plus Crafts. If the relic smith is enchanting an object of their own design and making, the base difficulty is 6, and if they are enchanting a ready-made, the difficulty goes up to 8. The core book doesn't answer questions related to the frequency of use, how often you can use the item, or the dice pool of the relic. Indeed, that roll isn't mentioned at all. We are only told an activation roll needs to be made unless the item is attuned to the user, but we're not told how to quantify or what to roll for the effects of the relic in question. I think we can all agree the core book has some serious gaps in the mechanics and some very poor phrases that leave the reader questioning their textual comprehension skills, but it's good to see the writers were aware of these things and they tried clarifying them in the player's guide. So, before we get serious with roles, rules, and modifiers, some general considerations. If the Malefactor is familiar with at least the first dot of the lore they are enchanting the relic with, there is no increase to the base difficulty and they can create the item without any aid. However, if they are unfamiliar with the required body of lore, they can simply get help from another Fallen who can embed their evocation into the relic, but in this case, the base difficulty goes up by 1 and the minimum successes required also goes up by 2. This is a great addition to the rules because it makes effects more accessible, it encourages collaboration between the players, and it prevents the Relic Smith from becoming like a Swiss army knife of first dot evocations. Another very important general mention is that the Dexterity plus Crafts roll for creating the relic is extended, with one roll being made for each in-game day the character spends working, and nowhere does it say these rolls need to be consecutive. So the character might put in a little work today, take care of more urgent matters in the following days, and return to crafting the relic next week. There's no urgency or time limit, and the enchantment comes into full effect when the required successes are accumulated, regardless of how long that takes. Another important thing, the effect of the relic is perfectly stable, so the item either evokes the low torment version of an evocation or the high torment version of an evocation. There is no going back and forth, no risk of accidents. The only thing intentional or accidental high torment uses of Enchant Object affects is the cost of using the item. Using tormented enchanted relics will either harm the user or bestow more torment. Now, the cost of this evocation is not one temporary faith point as mentioned in the core book, but a number of temporary faith points equal to the highest evocation required. So if the Malefactor wants to create a statuette of healing, heal is a third dot evocation of the Lore of Awakening, so 3 temporary faith points need to be spent to cement the evocation into the finalized relic. If they want to create a statuette of healing and restoration, which not only heals fresh wounds but also restores missing limbs and such using the Lore of the Flesh, the faith cost is 4, because Restore Flesh is a 4th dot evocation. It is unclear whether the cost needs to be paid all at once, but given the botch rules in the player's guide, I do believe it can be spent point by point throughout the making of the relic, and of course needs to be paid in full once the item is finalized if it hasn't been paid already. Once the item is completed, it can be activated with a faith roll or by spending a temporary faith point. If the item is attuned to the user, no activation roll is necessary and we can get right to the effects roll. The basic unmodified effects dice pool of an enchanted item is equal to the enchanter's own dice pool for that particular evocation. In the case of the healing statuette, it's going to be the Malefactor's own stamina plus medicine. Also, the base frequency with which someone can use a relic is once per scene, but all of these factors can be modified during the creation process. Now we're getting to the tricky stuff. To successfully make an enchanted object, the Malefactor needs a certain number of successes, which depends entirely on what they want the relic to do. A basic enchanted object requires a number of successes equal to twice the highest evocation needed for its effect. So if we want to create a basic enchanted relic that summons rats, which is the first dot of the Lore of the Beast, we need to accumulate only 2 successes on the extended roll. Easy peasy. If we want to create a Relic of Cleansing, the second dot of the Lore of Awakening, we need 4 successes on the extended roll. The resulting relic can be used only once per scene and has an effect dice pool equal to the Relic Smith's own, as mentioned before. There are, however, material requirements in play, and that is why I will display a little table on the screen. As you can see, the quality of materials used not only depends on the character's resources background, but also dictates the maximum number of required successes the item can handle. If the relic to be created requires more successes than the materials allow, the character needs to get better materials. For instance, the rat summoning relic we mentioned can be made using shoddy mundane items because it only requires a base of 2 successes. The cleansing relic, however, requires 4, so it cannot be done without adequate materials. There are quite a few modifiers to a basic relic. If the player wants to increase the number of uses per scene, each additional use increases the required successes by 1. If the player is unsatisfied with a base effect dice pool, they can make one from scratch. They can make an effects dice pool where each additional success required to build the item translates to 2 dice in the relic's effects pool. So if the player wants to use the Relic of Cleansing 2 times per scene and wants the relic to have an effects dice pool of 6 dice, both of these effects add 4 to the successes needed to make the item, 1 for frequency of use and 3 for the effects dice pool. So now the required successes for the cleansing relic is no longer 4 but 8, which means good materials will have to be used in the making of this enchanted object, requiring a resource background of 3. But the successes required can also be diminished if the player decides each activation of the item comes with a cost or sacrifice. If each activation requires an onerous sacrifice, such as taking a level of damage as the user spills their blood over the relic, the number of successes required goes down by 1. If the sacrifice is severe, implying murder or losing a permanent health level, the successes required can be reduced by 2. As with Enchant Object, the first level evocation, Ravaging, spending temporary faith and making use of resonance will also assist the creation of enchanted objects by either adding dice to the evocation dice pool, bestowing automatic successes, or lowering the difficulty. Okay, let's condense all of this information down into a quick enchanted relic creation example. Our Malefactor already knows the first dot of the Lore of the Flesh and wants to create the aforementioned Statuette of Healing and Restoration, which makes use of Lore of Awakening 3 and the Lore of the Flesh 4. The base number of successes required is 8, but because our Malefactor will need the aid of a Scourge for the Lore of Awakening part, we add 2 more successes for 1 additional collaborator, so the number of required successes is 10. The player also wants to use the relic twice per scene, that's +1, and wants the item to have its own dice pool of only 4, so that's another +2. Currently, the required number of successes is 13, so this is a super expensive item. The player adds an onerous sacrifice condition dictating that anyone using the relic must spill their blood onto the statuette, suffering a -1 wound penalty for the rest of the scene due to the dizziness and lightheadedness of bleeding themselves. This brings the final number of required successes to 12, so the resource background requirement is 4. Luckily, our Malefactor has that part covered. Now we need to determine the difficulty of the roll. The player decides they are making the statuette from scratch after acquiring all the necessary materials using the shape object evocation. After a few days' work, what we're looking at is a hand-sized statuette made of gold, with emerald eyes and rhodium thread hair, depicting a relieved person kneeling before a small ruby fountain, with its hands buried deep in its own torso through the rib cage, painlessly massaging and healing its own internal organs. Splendid, given that this is the physical container of the evocation, something that was made by the Malefactor from multiple parts. The difficulty is 6, which goes up by 1 because of the Scourge collaborator. The storyteller, however, decides the statuette really resonates with the effects of the relic, so resonance is going to bring the difficulty back down to 6. As soon as 4 faith points are spent and 12 successes are achieved on the extended daily roll, the relic comes into being, perfectly functional. When used, the ruby pool sucks up all of the user's spilt blood and either restores the body to a complete form or heals the gravest of fresh wounds. There we go, and I think it goes without saying, this evocation is smashing, even despite the mechanical restrictions it has when it comes to the resources background. Relics are rare and valuable and can be used once per scene, which, depending on the effect, can make their possessors a lot of money, or make them effectively superhuman. As such, relics should be uncommon in a demon game. Rare, coveted. I love this evocation. Okay, final dot. Imbu Object. While the ability to enchant objects made the Anunnaki much sought after among the fallen, this evocation made them equally feared as well, allowing a malefactor to bind a soul, mortal or demon, into a specially prepared reliquary or object. System. Your character must prepare a suitable vessel to hold the spirit in question. This vessel must be made of natural materials and be shaped by hand. If the malefactor made the vessel herself, the difficulty to perform this evocation is 6. Otherwise, it's 8. With this vessel in hand, your character can use the evocation on any disinterred spirit, such as a demon stripped of its host body or a ghost, within a number of yards equal to her faith score. Spend 1 faith and roll stamina plus crafts in a resisted roll versus the target's willpower. If your effort is successful, the spirit is bound into the vessel. Mortal souls bound this way cannot interact with the physical world. Demons, on the other hand, can still use their inherent powers and their lore paths, provided they have available faith. Any existing pacts with mortal thralls remain in effect. The only way to free a soul thus bound is to destroy the vessel that contains it. Torment. Monstrous demons who bind souls with this evocation are tainted by the Malefactor's torment, twisting the spirits into maddened, malevolent entities. Mortal souls bound in this fashion suffer a permanent derangement determined by the storyteller. Fallen, bound thus, have their permanent torment increased by a number of successes generated by the stamina plus crafts roll used to anchor them. Before we proceed, we have a few important mentions. The spirit needs to be unbound from any physical form, which means the evocation must be performed very swiftly and with absolute precision, lest the spirit get away. The binding is never an extended roll, even though crafting a suitable vessel is. And this is where things get complicated. Some spirits, such as recently deceased wraiths, can be forced into forms that don't really resonate with them because they don't have enough willpower to resist the evocation. But binding powerful fallen into a relic requires a lot of research, and finding a physical form that truly resonates with the spirit being bound. Maybe something that has a personal meaning or a personal connection, because such spirits can easily resist using their willpower. Finding something that facilitates the binding is very difficult because the fallen won't share these kinds of intimate details. Knowing the target's house, war history, celestial name, details about their time in the pit, or true name syllables will definitely make the process easier. Then, crafting the vessel is, just as with any other mundane item creation, an extended dexterity plus crafts roll. The suitability of the vessel dictates the difficulty of the evocation, and usually the more expensive it is, the more alluring and easier to use. Even if the item doesn't have a personal resonance with the target, using expensive materials such as crystals, gems, or precious metals is difficulty 7, with difficulty 8 being reserved for quality, non-precious materials, and difficulty 9 is reserved for an artificial mundane item, something that really has not even the slightest resonance with the spirit being bound. And now we get to the awesome mechanics from the player's guide. Successes on the evocation roll can be invested in either strength of binding or empowerments. If no successes are invested in binding, the spirit is bound into the object for sure, but it's completely free from the evoker's control. With one success, it is sometimes compelled to obey the commands or requests of the evoker, but it can also resist with a successful willpower roll. With 2 successes, the spirit can only resist if the evoker's command goes against its nature, and with 3 successes invested in this, the bound spirit cannot resist any command. Important to know, the spirit can only be compelled by the evoker. If someone else picks up the demonic relic, the spirit within is free to do whatever it wants in accordance with its ability to do so and cannot be compelled. Now we get to the empowerments, and these are so interesting. Each success achieved on the evocation roll bestows 1 empowerment, and the list is as follows. Keen senses. The spirit can detect other spirits, invisible entities, or see in the dark even though it doesn't have sensory organs. Communication. The spirit can communicate telepathically with whoever is holding the relic. Vessel control. The spirit can animate the relic as if it were its own body. Couple this with keen senses, and a possessed vehicle can drive itself as long as it can see where it's going. Enhanced durability. The spirit's stamina is added to the relics. And finally, spiritual infusion, which can have 2 effects. The first is that the fallen trapped within can use 3 evocations from any of its lores, and only 3 as chosen by the player and the storyteller, since it is a bound spirit and doesn't have access to all of its potency. The second effect is that the fallen might imbue the relic with its own nature and ability, making it easier to use if the relic can be used for an action that resonates with the spirit trapped within. A slayer trapped within an executioner's sword, for instance, might decrease the difficulty of damage rolls, making the weapon devastating in combat, while a fiend trapped in this manner, probably in a super expensive pair of crystal glasses, might enhance the wearer's ability to find and piece together useful information, lowering the difficulty of perception, research, investigation, or occult rolls. And finally, despite what's been mentioned in the core book, we get a different answer to a question regarding faith. Do fallen imprisoned in relics regain faith from pre-existing pacts? According to the player's guide, no, they do not. However, if the user of such items reaps faith using the relic itself, then they choose how much of the reaped faith to share with the prisoner. Another way for a trapped fallen to gain faith is to make a new pact after it has been trapped, provided it can communicate with a mortal who is in the vicinity of the relic. Important rules mention these demonic relics might be sentient and they can converse, but their abilities are limited. Those abilities are defined when allocating the successes scored on the evocation roll to empowerments. After that, it's set in stone and cannot be changed later, though it might be changed if the spirit is released and moved to a new relic that resonates with other fragments of its being. This is up for storyteller interpretation. As a final mention, these relics are not indestructible. As soon as a demonic item is destroyed, the spirit bound within is completely free to seek out any other vessel, to dive into the low umbra if it's a wraith, or to return to the pit. I really like this evocation because it allows the player to create very interesting scenarios for everyone around, but I especially like it because it allows the storyteller to introduce and create these very interesting characters which aren't in human bodies, but they also aren't tormented earthbound per se. They're just trapped in relics. Will your protagonist release the prisoner from a found demonic item? Will they try to negotiate a mutually beneficial agreement, or will they try to intimidate or force the spirit into servitude? Who is the spirit and how did it come to be imprisoned in such a way? So many questions. A whole story, and maybe even a whole chronicle, can revolve around one such mysterious entity or item, which might sit at the center of a whole web of deception just waiting to be unraveled. Very nice. Alright, having finally gone through all of the evocations, let's have a look at the apocalyptic forms next. Mumu, the Visage of the Forge. The Angels of the Forge appear as giants hammered from the black iron of the earth, their powerfully muscled forms lit with veins of hot magma, and their eyes shining like discs of burnished brass. Their voices are deep and thunderous, like the roar of a furnace. When in their apocalyptic form, these fallen are immune to extremes of temperature and pressure. They can handle hot coals as mortals do ice cubes. The Visage of the Forge confers the following special capabilities. Master Artisan. The difficulty of all crafts rolls decrease by 2. Increased size. The character's body grows to 1/3 again its own height, adding the following bonus traits: +2 to strength, +1 dexterity, +1 to stamina. Thunderous voice. The character's shout shatters glass and makes stones tremble. Individuals within a number of yards equal to the character's faith score suffer 4 dice of bashing damage. This ability may be used only once per scene, and it requires an action to perform. Immune to fire. The character is immune to damage from fire. Torment. High Torment Mumu are nightmarish creatures of iron skin and serrated blades, wounded by a haze of smoldering brimstone. Their eyes are twin globes of roiling fire, and wherever they go, electrical devices go berserk. Lights flicker and televisions and radios are afflicted with static. The Visage of the Forge confers the following High Torment special capabilities. Blades. The fingers of the Mumu end in curved blades of razor-sharp iron, inflicting strength +2 aggravated damage. Extra limbs. The demon grows a second set of arms. Extra arms allow a character to parry or block hand-to-hand or melee attacks without sacrificing her own attack, or make up to 2 additional attacks of her own per turn, which are considered multiple actions. Magnetic field. The demon is surrounded by a magnetic field intense enough to disrupt electronic devices within a radius in yards equal to the character's faith. Iron skin. The character's iron-like skin acts as armor, providing 4 additional dice to soak, bashing, lethal, and aggravated damage. It's very interesting to finally see what Master Artisan does in the context of this lore. The processes, successes required, and especially the costs of creating relics are pretty much the same for all malefactors, but those of the Forge get decreased difficulty on the extended roll, which effectively means they have less chances to botch their rolls, and they get the crafting process done quicker, and that's about it. So I like this form precisely because it doesn't make a world of a difference in the way the evocations work, but it does absolutely provide an edge, especially in more mundane crafting endeavors. Sweet! Increased size coupled with immunity to fire is just amazing. Imagine this living humanoid forge handling white-hot metal without a care, or running through the fire to get someone out of a burning building. So good. Thunderous Voice, however, isn't that great since it can only be used once per scene. Everyone and everything is affected, friend or foe, and you also need to roll those 4 dice for bashing damage. I don't really see this form being useful in a lot of circumstances. The High Torment forms are fantastic in a physical confrontation. Strength +2 aggravated damage, Freddy Krueger finger blades, extra limbs, Iron Skin which offers additional physical resilience even against aggravated damage, and Magnetic Field which is much more discreet than the other High Torment forms, but great for ruining a computer, a phone, cameras, lights, and so on. However, if the disruption isn't final and the object isn't broken in the process of using this, I don't see why it would be a High Torment effect. Perhaps Magnetic Field would have been better off as a low torment, and Thunderous Voice, clearly offensive to everything around the character, would have been better as High Torment, maybe dealing lethal damage instead of bashing, maybe aggravated damage to objects. It's just a thought. So, after 2 episodes and copious amounts of additional mechanics and rules, there we have it. The lore of the Forge, the ability to instantly understand the intended function of a tool, to repair it, to enhance its functionality, to activate it from a distance, to reshape materials, to enchant objects, imbuing them with the lores of the other houses, and finally, to bind mortal or fallen souls to suitable vessels, creating either demonic relics or reliquaries. Though it might seem a little complicated at first given the pages upon pages of details and rules and options, crafting is actually pretty straightforward and very enjoyable in Demon the Fallen. I'm very happy the materials required for relics are treated as abstract categories, depending on the resource background, and not an actual list of endless materials. Thus, it's easy to use once you follow the basic steps, and this approach encourages the player to fill in the details and describe just how the relic looks and feels. And that means the possibilities are endless. Wonderful. Thank you so much for listening, take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.